Stay hungry, stay foolish.
Flex is a manifesto for living and working on your terms. It means looking at the established, rigid ways of doing things and asking, is this really working for me? If the answer to that question is no, then this book is for you. When we learn how to flex, we gain a superpower that allows us to challenge what is holding us back and reinvent the rules for a smarter, happier life. Because things are changing for women across the globe, we are getting married and having children later, if at all. Dual income families have replaced the traditional template of a man as a breadwinner and a woman as a homemaker. Technology allows us to work differently and understand ourselves better, but the old systems still persist. We're continually bashing up against inflexible structures that were built by and for men. We are trying to do everything and following a rulebook that we didn't write. We welcome the author of this fabulous book, Flex. Annie Auerbach, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Annie, I absolutely love the book, and I spoke there as we, and I tried to wear a pin that always reflects each individual episode, and today I'm wearing yin and yang because I really felt that this book gave me empathy for the female brain, the female life, how the workplace was, etc. And in doing that, it made me more integrated as a result. And I think that's really, really important. And we were talking off air about how so many men commented on these aha moments or these light bulb moments as they read the book. Before we get into it, I'd love if you'd share those experiences that you had.
Thank you so much. Well, so the reason why I look at it through a female lens to begin with is because looking back at the history of flexible working, it's often women, often mums who have been the pioneers, who have been chipping away at the old systems and structures and trying to make things work. Because, as you so brilliantly talked about in the introduction, so many of the systems that we work and live through have been seen through a male lens and created by and for men. But having said that, my strong feeling and belief is flex is an ideology that's come of age and is there for all of us, whether we're young or older, men or women, whether we're starting out in our careers and just on our learning journeys, or whether we want to transition into a slower pace of life. All of this, all of the ways that we'll discuss around flexible working and living can benefit us as a society. And it feels really brilliant to feel that we're doing it as allies, shoulder to shoulder. As you say, it's something that we can all benefit together.
Yeah, and it's so important, again, for innovation and neurodiversity. One of the things we talk about often on the show is neurodiversity, and that's harnessing the minds of everybody. And we're going to dig deeper into that. But you rightly recognize right at the start of the book, when we prioritize the wrong things like long working hours over friendships, exams over mental agility, climbing the established career ladder over cutting our own paths, we diminish and inhibit ourselves and our possibilities.
So I sort of feel that so much of this stuff has been handed down wisdom that we've internalized and believe that that's just the way things should be. But we're in a plastic moment at the moment. The pandemic has shown us that things are possible that we never thought would be possible. So many businesses that I've been talking to Flex about said, absolutely, it couldn't happen in my industry for this, and this reason. And now, on a dime, we're pivoting towards remote working from anywhere. All these different types of models are flourishing. So it feels like this plastic moment is one of change, possibility. Let's challenge what didn't work and shed stuff that was holding us back and reinvent.
And just to give our audience a bit of understanding about the book, because across the 5 chapters of the book, and it's a short read written for the times that we're in as well. So everybody's busy, everybody is stressed, and you write it for that world as well. And I thought that was really interesting to add. But you write it through 5 lenses. The first is work, obviously, so flexible work. But then you go further and you talk about flexible minds, homes, bodies, and indeed our futures. So let's jump into it and begin, as you do in the book, with Let's Flex the Mind. Here you dig into the key ingredients for creativity and explore how our environments have conspired against us to make us inflexible.
Thank you for explaining those different chapters. I wanted to start by saying that we tend to shortcut towards flex and work. And my aim for all of this is to have a holistic vision of what we're living through in our lives. And of course, our lives aren't, as small as the four corners of our offices, or indeed the four corners of our Zoom screens. We're messy human beings with lives that are outside the workplace, and we need to think about that, and we need to think about it in a holistic way. So I started with flex in the mind. And the reason being is because we know that one of the key skills for the future will be creativity, to be able to think out of the box, to be able to think innovatively, come up with new solutions to age-old problems. However, life is conspiring to make us less creative and to kind of stick us into smaller boxes and echo chambers. I started by thinking about, well, what actually is creativity? Because for me, thinking about creativity is coming up with something brand new that no one had ever thought about. That feels incredibly daunting to me. And I didn't really know where to start with that as an idea. But actually, thinking about creativity is taking two different pieces of knowledge or ideas or frames of reference that hadn't been put together before. That gives a spark of something fresh and gives us a whole new fresh perspective. And one of the stories that I talked about in the first chapter was about Alfred Russel Wallace and Charles Darwin, because they made their theories of evolutions around about the same time, but did it quite independently of one another. And why did that happen? And when you dig into it, there's certain things that they both did. So both traveled extensively. Darwin around the world in HMS Beagle. Wallace traveled to the Amazon and also the Malay archipelago. And all the time what they're doing is they're observing really unfamiliar and different things, whether it be plant species, animal species, the terrain. Constantly they're looking at things that they've never seen before. And weirdly and interestingly, both read an essay at the same time as well. They read Malthus's essay on the principle of population, and somehow reading about overpopulation, as well as seeing all this unfamiliar stuff through travel, sparked thoughts about evolution through natural selection in two different people at the same time. And this was something super interesting because it was the connection of seemingly unconnected ideas that created innovation.
Yeah, and I love this because you say that cross connection may be the actual key to creativity. And I was telling you before we came on air that one of my practices is each week I write an article, and it's half inspired by the guest and then half inspired by something totally unrelated, and create a metaphor from that. And in a way, what I've been doing for years is training myself for this cross connection. But you talk about Arthur Koestler in his book, The Act of Creation, and he talks about something called bisociation. And you say we've become quite poor at this because we don't actually have the bandwidth. And this is an important aspect of your work because you aim to give us time back and to work to our maximum ability in order for us to be able to maximize our cognitive flexibility. Yeah, and I love this because you say that cross connection may be the actual key to creativity. And I was telling you before we came on air that one of my practices is each week I write an article, and it's half inspired by the guest and then half inspired by something totally unrelated, and create a metaphor from that. And in a way, what I've been doing for years is training myself for this cross connection. But you talk about Arthur Koestler in his book, The Act of Creation, and he talks about something called bisociation. And you say we've become quite poor at this because we don't actually have the bandwidth. And this is an important aspect of your work because you aim to give us time back and to work to our maximum ability in order for us to be able to maximize our cognitive flexibility.
Yes, yeah. So Koestler calls this idea of smashing two different frames of reference together. He calls it bisociation. And funnily enough, it happens in jokes, right? So when we tell a joke, we often put together two unexpected things. The term, the sort of Greek term, is called paraprosdokion, which is the Greek for against expectation. So there's various different jokes. Groucho Marx has a typical joke of, I had a perfectly lovely evening, but this wasn't it. And it's kind of like a dad joke, right? It's sort of, you're on one route and then you're pulled back. But that, in a way, taking these two different frames of reference and putting them together, as you say, is a really interesting spark for innovation. But because of social media, because of algorithmic culture, we're being forced into echo chambers where we're listening to a same version of ourselves again and again, whether that be the kind of self-fulfilling prophecy where you end up watching something on Netflix and then, you get recommended something very similar back because it gets to know your taste, or Amazon, you buy a book and then here are other people bought this book, read these things. So you end up with quite a narrow set of cultural references. And if we're seeing bisociation is quite broad and random and sporadic, where are we getting that from? We have to deliberately intervene in ourselves to try and escape that narrowness and that kind of echoing monoculture.
You jump then to WorkFlex. So you tee us up in a way, you give us the lens of MindFlex, and then you go into WorkFlex. And you tell us about the time you reached the holy grail, 3 days per week. You were like, yes, after maternity leave. And you thought it was fantastic, but it was far from it. And I'll share some examples because you give some examples of stuff that happened. And I'm sure this will resonate with our audience who've been in the same place as you were. When you left work bang on time, you'd feel your colleagues' raised eyebrows and disapproval that would haunt you all the way to the tube station. When you arrived sweating, frazzled and tense to take over from the nanny and at the battleground that was the toddler's bath time, you were stressed out of your head. When you sat on the loo seat and mindlessly chugged a 10-minute Instagram fix for your job, all these things come together and we all have our versions of those. And so do men as well. We sneak in a bit of work, maybe on the loo seat, as you mentioned there as well. And it's wrong. This is very wrong of us.
It is. It's kind of, it feels such a own goal. You've done the hard work, you've done the negotiation, you've managed to get the flexible work, but you feel so painfully grateful and guilty at the same time that you almost erode all of those beautiful boundaries that you've managed to negotiate and build into your life. And I remember a particularly poignant thing was, so I was working a 3-day week and I'd be with my daughter. My husband was also working a shorter week so he could look after her. And I was at the playground at the sandpit, and everyone who was there was on their phone tapping out emails because we were stressed and we were trying to hold down our jobs and our kids were there. And I read a newspaper article which said the number of playground injuries had gone up since the introduction of the iPhone. And it's just like, oh my goodness, what's going on here? And it's this kind of feeling of guilt and, the notion of flexism that exists in the workplace, which is that once you've been granted flexible work, there's prejudice within the business against it. So you're considered less committed, you're considered first out the door, you're considered, going onto the mummy track or the daddy track if you've managed to take flexible working as a new father. That feels incredibly difficult to break through. It's a cultural change as well as simply getting the thing on paper.
So let's dive into a little bit more, and then I'll expand a little bit on flexible work because many people will love to hear your insights on this, which are fantastic. You say getting flexible time like you did is just the start, because then we have to make it work for us. And you draw inspiration here, going right back to where many thoughts began, which was the time of Galileo, and you call this coffee breaks and synchronized time.
Yeah, I thought, I love a little story, and there's something when you're thinking about time, time seems massively important, our concept of time and protecting our time when we think about flexibility. Flexibility can seem sort of soft and pliable, and definitely during the pandemic, time's oozed out, hasn't it? And we've sort of work and leisure and home is all blended together. So I wanted to think precisely about time. And if you zoom back to 1583, Galileo is a young student, and he's sat in the Duomo di Pisa, and he's looking up. It's mass. He's probably bored. He's looking up at, distracted by the swinging of a pendulum clock, and this inspires him to invent. He's looking at a swinging lamp, and this inspires him to invent the pendulum clock. And what the pendulum clock does is gives us synchronized time. So we're all on the same time schedule. Before, there was lots of kind of merging around time, but this allowed us to all be on the same page. And then if you go forward a little bit, that almost ends up 1817. Robert Owen is the Welsh social reformer, and he's looking at the way that we're working in factories. And he's actually saying what we need now is 8 hours labor, 8 hours recreation, and 8 hours rest. In other words, putting us all on this kind of synchronized schedule that allows us to have the right balance in life.
It's interesting because I thought about that a lot, actually, that particular story, and that so time is essentially a man-made creation. So we humankind made time. I came up with the concept of it because I was mentioning to you in my own book, I draw on a lot of stories as well, and analogies like you did, and history and nature, etc. But one of the things I found really interesting is that some tribes still don't have that time. So the Inuits, for example, or in Eastern cultures, the idea of time is cyclical rather than linear. And here in the West, we tend to think of, even life as you're born, you go to school, a bunch of stuff happens in the middle and you die. Instead of actually the idea that there's constant cycles. And I'm probably skipping ahead a little bit here to the end, where if you have that concept of time as cyclical, plus you ignore in a way as much as you can this common denominator of what time is, and you work to yourself and your bodily rhythms, etc., you can actually be way more at peace with the world. And also, if, for example, you work in a gig economy, or if you move from role to role, you have job mobility, or you've left a job and you want to reinvent yourself, the cyclical element of time means that last thing wasn't a failure, or it wasn't over, it wasn't final. I have some value in what happened there to me there. And this happens for a life experience as well. You gather assets from the ashes where you can go on and bring them into your next part of your life.
Oh, I think that's a really beautiful interpretation, and I really like it. Of course, women's bodies' clocks are cyclical, and that's a rhythm that's kind of very at peace with us. And the idea as well that you're not fixed into a linear vision of what life and success is. So, as you say, you start off life with education. That education then is paid out over a lifetime as you climb the career ladder, or you settle down, and then you transition to a time of leisure where you retire. That simply doesn't mirror the way people are living life at the moment. As you say, the gig economy, or much more change of jobs and pivots as we evolve, and as technology changes and we need to reskill, and as we're working longer working lives as well. So thinking in terms of transitions and cycles feels actually a healthier way to have a more sustainable life and career, really.
Yeah, and I want to dive in a bit, because I'll come back to the menstrual cycle as well. It's a really important aspect here. And for the men listening who don't want to listen to this, do, because you do a fabulous job of giving us empathy for what's happening. And you talk here next about presenteeism, and you say the big irony about bums on seats is that these long-suffering bums are proving to be very unproductive. working longer hours doesn't always translate into more productivity. And in fact, you cite a study in France, the average French worker produces more by the end of a Thursday than their UK equivalent does in a full week. This is really important and something that employers need to get their head around.
Exactly, because we've had an assumption that long working hours denotes commitment, denotes productivity, efficiency, and it's simply not true. In fact, the problem is one of burnout. So even prior to the pandemic, the World Health Organization had identified burnout as one of the biggest issues in workplace health. So actually what we really need to do is uncouple productivity from success. And, you know, there's so many cliches about the way that the French work, you know, oh, they take really long lunches and, oh, they take the summer off. But yes, yet their productivity is higher than the UK productivity. So I really think that there's something that we need to talk about, which is trust, because I believe that long working hours, presenteeism, surveillance culture is all linked to a lack of trust. And we need to create new models of trust which are not built on the hours that you put in, but rather on the outcome and the impact of what you do.
So it's outcome based. I think that's so important. But again, employers then need to actually put the work in to come up with what the outcome might be. So it requires a total recalibration of the workplace. And I wanted to mention something here because I've done this, and when I read it, I had a little bit of shame about this, where one, you say about leaving on time. So there's sometimes a stigma about that, about leaving on time. The other thing, though, is a thing you call leavism. And this is where people don't take their holidays. And this is massive in the West. But a lot of people, and indeed the East now, a lot of people aren't taking their holidays. One of the dreads for people, even when they're on holidays, is I'll just check my email to get rid of a few so I don't have to come back to this massive full inbox. This is a very important part that you talk about. Exactly.
So there's a feeling that you need to be digitally present even though you're not physically present, which means you never fully untether. And interestingly, in Europe, they're creating laws which allow you to disconnect at the end of the day. And you're not constantly tethered to your device. And it's important because rest and recuperation, we've already talked about burnout, but rest and recuperation are important if we will back there to creativity as well. There's a really interesting study which shows that 1 in 5 founders of startups got their idea for their business whilst they were on vacation. And so if you don't stop and pause and rest and allow ideas to percolate, if you're constantly in churn mode, it's very, very hard to come up with something fresh. My business, Starling, I run a trends agency called Starling. We take the summers off. And that was a really kind of nerve-wracking decision for a startup because, you know, you clearly want to be there for your clients and you want to be able to be there and to be visible all the time. However, if your product is fresh thinking and you never stop, you're going to be stale. And so it's something that we found that was super important to us.
Then you talk about another cohort, which is called the sandwich generation that many of our audience may not have heard of. I'd love if you expand on this one.
The sandwich generation is really my generation. It's people that are looking after kids and elderly parents at the same time. So we're trying to work and we're also pulled in these two different caring directions. The burden of care is often on women's shoulders, and the pandemic has shown that actually as much as the progress in the workplace prior to the pandemic seemed to be positive, there's been a huge hemorrhage of women from the workplace because of caring responsibilities, looking after children when the schools and childcare was shut, looking after elderly relatives. So feeling pulled in different directions and having a flexible schedule, just allowing you the breathing space to be able to do both, to be able to do the school run, to be able to pick up the milk for your mum, or to sit with her when she's feeling lonely, or take her to the doctor's appointment. These are small tweaks in schedules which actually are about humanity. But I don't want it all to be on women's shoulders, and I think there's social change which needs to happen around that too.
I found that really interesting, and I wanted to dive into that a bit because I actually spoke to my wife about this, and it happened actually while I was reading your book, which was interesting. She rang her brother, and I was like, is everything all right with him? And she goes, I just felt I hadn't talked to him in a while, and he's abroad, so I just thought I'd check in with him. And I was kind of going, I thought of your book, and it's like going, I would never think of doing that. And it's not, I just don't have that in me. But then you mentioned what you call the emotional burden, that often lies with women. And the excuse I would often make to myself is that a man's brain has evolved differently than a woman's brain. And the woman, and this is in some research where it's like the man's brain has been designed to go and hunt or gather, while the woman's brain has been evolved to mind the tribe and the future of the tribe, and the tribe gets on, etc. So there's a little inkling of that still in us, but it's not the excuse. And I actually questioned my excuse there and went, yeah, but it has to change somewhere. And that both takes a structural change in the brain, but also a cultural change and a societal change.
It does. And I think, we've been socialized from an early age. Little girls have been socialized to check that people are okay. I think I use a phrase in the book, I think, which is about kind of psychic antenna constantly quivering. Like, does everyone have enough food? Is my brother okay? I haven't got this one's going through a divorce. I should pick up the phone. And it's this ticker tape and there's practical things in there as well, which are chores and housework and something's broken or insurance or all of these things. But there's also this emotional ticker tape, which has been socialized into us as women to constantly be alert. And it's really interesting because it impacts flow. So the concept of flow, when you can get into deep work, it's been shown during the pandemic that women are interrupted much more in their work than men have been. And geographically in the house, when everybody who is able to has been working from home, men tend to have had spaces which are more closed off, and women tend to be in the open plan kitchen where their kids are doing the thing and they might need something printed out and So you can automatically see that that men have more protected time and space than women, as well as this emotional load thing. And it's really tricky to unpick. And I wanted to address it in a chapter called Flex in the Home, which dug deep into that, because I just don't feel like we'll ever get flexibility of work unless we have it at home as well.
Yeah, and it raises a really important thing, because a thought that might come up would be, well, we need to prioritize whoever the larger breadwinner is. But you actually say that's not the case. Oftentimes, when the woman is the bigger breadwinner or earner, that the man will actually become more complacent in the home place.
I was surprised by that as well. Maybe I wasn't, but there's a study which showed that, I think that we're also, there's a cultural discourse which we've all internalized, and which is, if you're at the point of starting a family and you're thinking about childcare and costs, there's a point at which a calculation is done, which is the woman's income. Does it equate to childcare costs? Is it a bit more? Is it a bit less? And there's something that happens there, which then means that she might say something like, it doesn't make financial sense, I'm going to give up my job, Now, I really challenge that, because children are household income. So a household cost, as well as the emotional joy that they bring, obviously. But they're a household cost. So it should be calculated out of a bucket of both incomes. And we should also see it as, the cost of women coming out of the workplace at that point. It's not just that, it's also all her future earnings. And it's the opportunity cost of not being in the workplace. So it's a really tricky thing just to do it on economics and numbers, and we need to think quite carefully about that. Because I think it then gets in the situation where it's very hard for women to re-enter the workplace and to return after having children. So those cultural assumptions to do with money are something that need to be unpicked as well.
I wanted to just share a brilliant excerpt that really jumped out to me and spoke to me, and also I had massive empathy for. And it goes as follows. The biggest worry people have about working flexibly is that they will be perceived to be less dedicated. You share here how one of your friends told you about a recent job interview. She explained to her potential employer she would like to work one day from home because she lived a 90-minute commute away, so she could pick up the kids from school and work extra during the time she would save on the commute. But they turned her down. And this is where you emphasize trust. But I wanted to also add on to this that we've seen a lot of this during the pandemic where, you know, there's a saying called any turkey can fly in a storm. So anybody can say they're a great leader when the business environment's good, et cetera, but when it comes to moments, crunch moments like the pandemic, where maybe the business is under a bit more stress, micromanagement had a huge uptick where people were being watched. It's like, am I getting money from these people because they're working from home? I'd love your thoughts on that.
The big pushback on businesses prior to the pandemic would be the worry that you would shirk from home, right? So when we're working from home, we're not working at all. We're watching television, or, you know, we're taking a dog for a walk or whatever. Now, that isn't the case. And actually, the issue has been men and women have been working longer working hours when they've been working home. So the average workday has gone up across Europe by about 48 minutes. A 13% increase in meetings during the day. Our workload has got bigger. So this huge psychological worry, which is that working from home would mean that people don't work, is simply not true. But because we have old school models of trust, whereby trust is equated to presenteeism and long working hours, there's been this uptick, as you say, in digital surveillance. So technological solutions which show if I've been inactive at my keyboard, away from my desk, not replying to Slack messages, etc., etc. And all of this is really insidious because, you know, if you don't trust somebody, they shouldn't be on your team. They shouldn't be working for you. What we need to do is, in a situation where people are working more remotely or in a more distributed workforce, we need to be very clear about what we want people to do and what the tasks are and what the timeline is and what the outcomes are. And actually, we're not trained for that. We're more trained to sit there and watch people and then, you know, bump into them and say, hey, have you done the thing? And when's the thing happening? And so it actually requires a different type of communication and planning that hasn't been there. But if people are given a set of instructions that make sense, are clear, are communicated in a way where we're all working forward to the same thing, we all have the same purpose in mind, then trust them, let them get on with it and do it in the best way possible. And all the evidence, all the research shows that it will happen and people will thrive.
I wanted to jump to something about home life, because you dedicated a whole chapter to the home life as well. And this is something that we all feel, whether it be a man or a woman, doesn't matter. And you say the tug of home life can be intense at times, while at other times it can be imperceptible. Shutting the front door when you leave for work can sometimes feel like an escape, but sometimes it feels like an abandonment. And we've all felt that.
I think it's, you know, we're not machines. Life delivers curveballs to us at any given time. Sometimes things are going really well and actually, you know, we're straight out the door and we're inspired by what we're doing, or we're excited by what we're doing, and we don't give home a second thought. But sometimes home needs our attention. I talk about Anne-Marie Slaughter in the book, and she was working for the Obama administration, and her team was going through some issues and wasn't working, and she was at a reception with, you know, the top people in politics in America, and her mind kept on tugging back to her teenager. I felt that. I'm sure all of us have felt that when something's not quite right at home. And the tragedy is when we feel that means we have to leave because we simply can't manage it because there's so little flexibility in our current job that we feel that that it can't work and we're forced out. Whereas a conversation about humanity and the fact that at this particular moment in time, this is happening, it won't always be the case. This too will pass. And, there'll be another time when we're thriving and things are easy peasy. But can we have flex in this moment? And I think we just need to acknowledge that life changes, transitions happen. Sometimes things are smooth, sometimes things are jagged. And why should we just have this linear vision like you described before? Why shouldn't we have ebb and flow?
Yeah, and we'll come back to that when we talk about bloody time, when we come back to that one. But before we do, you give some amazing examples of flexible working and some I hadn't heard of. And I'd love you to share these because you talk about job sharing all the way to flex banking.
Yes. So I think that for ages, we shortcutted to part-time work and it was called part-time. And even the name part-time sounds like, you're not committed. And then we shortcutted during the pandemic to working from home. But flex is not about either of those. There's a whole plethora of different manifestations of what flex could look like. So job sharing, which most people will be familiar with, but two people share the work and pay of a single full-time job. Flexi hours, an employee works a set amount of core hours from the office. For example, 10 to 3 might be their core hours. And then they work flexi hours from home around caring responsibilities, a school run, etc. Location flex, we already know, working from anywhere. One-off flex, that's what we were just talking about, wasn't it? Like life can happen. Let's not deny it. So instead of causing crises in people's life, let's allow them flex when they need it. Flex banking, you work a 4-day week, but get paid for a 4.5-day week. And that 0.5 is banked. So when the business needs you, because don't forget that flex can happen at the business end as well as at the individual worker end. So if the business is going through something which needs all hands on deck, then they can give you notice and book you in. Compressed hours, working the equivalent of full-time hours, but squashing it maybe into 4 days instead of 5. And phased retirement. Older workers can reduce their hours gradually and work part-time before transitioning to full-time retirement. Or indeed, because we're seeing such an uptick in entrepreneurialism of older people, they might want to phase out of salaried work into starting something new.
Yeah, I loved the phased retirement one. It's so clever. Even for somebody to become more accustomed to being at home more often. Because if you think about that, if there's one or other of the couple at home all the time and all of a sudden somebody's sitting on top of them, like we've experienced during the pandemic, that can feel invasive for people at home. So phasing in the retirement gives them an example of I've one foot in, but I'm also exploring what I'm going to do. So I'm not sitting on the couch all day.
Totally. My dad is 83 and he's still working. And I just don't think he can face the thought of retirement. And partly because we haven't, as a society, given much status to hobbies. They sound frivolous. They sound sort of like, stuff around the edges. But actually, if you think about hobbies as passions and the things we care about, and when you retire, you can transition towards doing something that you care deeply about for leisure. And if we haven't given time to that and energy for that, and society hasn't cared about it, when we retire, we're like, oh my God, where's my identity? What am I doing next? And it can be a quite frightening moment, I think.
Yeah, and you reminded me there of something that so much, and it happens in innovation as well. It happens in organizations where we talk a lot about psychological safety, the lack, the absence of fear of speaking up or calling something out or even suggesting an idea. And it made me think of how that happens in society when it comes to, for example, role swapping. So, for example, I say, I want to stay at home and raise the kids. And often what happens there is then society judges one or the other of the couples for their role choice. And this is a huge problem as well, because this is where the societal shift needs to happen.
It does. So I spoke to a lawyer in my book who they went through a transition. They've got 4 kids, and her partner decided to stay at home. And that was cool for them. They had to go through transitions in their own life because she had to relinquish hold of stuff that she wanted or had in the past controlled, and just said, well, it's going to happen that way. I can't get involved because this is a choice we've made. But also the people around them found it very hard to adjust. So if they wanted to arrange a play date, they'd be texting her and she's in court. She's like, text the dad, and that the shift around all of that is really important, because it's not just you making the change, it's the world recognizing your change and not holding it against you.
There's a lot of implicit and invisible judgment there. And it's like I actually thought of the idea of when you leave early, for example, or you leave bang on time, and it's like thoughts are energy, and you can feel that energy. And it's almost, you can see the thought bubbles coming out of people's heads. So to kind of going, I wonder, did he lose his job? I wonder, all these things that are happening. And then that reflects badly on the person who's making that decision as well. And this is something that I really thought was important to try and change. And your book has done that, hopefully.
Well, this is the thing, is that I actually just think it needs a rebrand, because, part-time working doesn't sound cool. I think flex does sound cool. When you type flex into your phone, the strong arm emoji comes up. And it's a creative, rebellious, innovative way to live your life. You're looking within, you're caring deeply about yourself and your loved ones, and you're creating a template from scratch that can work from you and can work for your business or the business you work for. So that for me is profoundly visionary. And instead of seeing these people as, out of sight, out of mind, these are the people who are naturally equipped with kind of visionary thinking. So, I think we need to flip the whole thing. We need to give it status within the business. So that's why I talk about flexible role models and, making flex sexy within the business, talking about people who are flexing with elegance and who are doing it brilliantly and showing their trajectories and their career development, leaving loudly for the bosses as well.
And it's important then as well for us as parents or mentors or coaches or uncles or aunts to be these strong role models. You mentioned author James Baldwin and how he said children have never been good at listening to their elders, but they have never failed to imitate them. And that's something that's always on my mind. I have 2 boys, and it's always on my mind to demonstrate like that I'm doing the housework. And that's like not even mentioning that that's a thing. Because I think if I was to even kind of go, look, daddy's, make a thing of it, then it becomes a thing and they might question it. So they just see me do it. And then I have it, they get pocket money for doing those tasks, some of those tasks as well that they can do. And it's that passing on of cultural knowledge that becomes really important as well, that I felt from your work.
Exactly. So it's just normalizing, de-shaming, making it part of life so that everybody can be lighter and happier. Because the outcome of all of it is not just everybody doing the crap. It's that we're all freed up and we've all got mental energy to do the good stuff too, to be more present, to be more ambitious more strategic with our time and energy.
I saw a thing, Annie, on LinkedIn the other day, and it was a very senior leader, a guy who shared on LinkedIn that he had a heart attack. And it showed a picture of him in a hospital bed with the mask on. And underneath he wrote, I had a heart attack. Here's what I thought when I had the heart attack. And it wasn't that his life flashed before him. And he went, oh crap, what am I going to do about this task and work? How am I going to get the funding for that thing? And he had at the very end his family. oh crap, I hope my wife doesn't find me dead here, right? And he had a list of things. And then he went, after the reflection, here's my new list. And everything that was in his life went to the top that was important: his family, his wife, his happiness, his health. And I thought about that. So few of us are lucky to get that warning shot, and it becomes increasing and important. And this is why you dedicate a whole chapter to flex and the body. And you share, which is really interesting, the way you did for the different types of flexible work that are available, the different types of chronotypes. Because I often think that we work to try and shore up our weaknesses all the time instead of leaning into our strengths.
Yes, exactly that. So chronotypes were interesting to me. So very broadly, you could be a morning lark, which means you jump out of bed quite earlier in the morning. You don't need your coffee to get going. You've got energy, but then you might have a slump around 3:00 and you go to bed early at night. Or you might be a night owl. So that's reversed. You have a very slow start in the morning. It takes you a while to get going, but then you have these peaks of productivity and energy later on in the evening. And then the middle people broadly are hummingbirds. And the 9 to 5 is really fit for the hummingbirds, and it doesn't really capitalize on anything that the larks and the owls bring to the picture. And so even the notion of the commute, all of that energy and imagination and synapses firing that the larks have is spent under someone's armpit in a sweaty train. Whereas if you allowed them, they will come in early or indeed work early and then come in later, you would be capitalizing on their peak rather than shoving them into this system in high. You think about the commute, I'm still bewildered by it looking back, that everybody at exactly the same time into these very dense, unhygienic, overcrowded situations which clash with the school run if you're a parent, in order to get us all into the same place at the same time. For what? For us all to sit in with headphones tapping away in silence. The whole thing seems absurd. And if you allow flexibility of your daily schedule with your chronotype, suddenly you will see that you're capturing all of this energy that would be shaved off at the edges.
I found that, right. So I had a career as a professional rugby player for a decade, and then I retired into the workplace. And it never made any sense to me why everybody took lunch at the same time and queued outside coffee shops. Or then I worked later in a public organisation, very archaic one, and everybody would go for lunch at the same time and spend half an hour queuing. And I was kind of going, why don't they just go an hour earlier? And then I zoomed out after a while and I realised actually it was the fear of judgment of others. That why is he going off? Why does he think he's special? Or this is certainly what you've felt from people. But it just made total sense from a management of your time. And speaking of that and building on what you talked about chronotypes, the next was absolutely brilliant for me. It was one of those things I talked about at the very start of the show that was an eye-opening, total lack of awareness. And you could empathize with me as a man as well, that how would I know? And this is why I think your work is so important. And in particular, this chapter was so important because you talk next about bloody time. And if we were to believe in empathy, it's essential for all of us to understand periods and menstrual cycles, because you share some top line information here, Annie. And, I mentioned in my notes, I'm constantly impressed by New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, and she recently brought out in New Zealand that menstrual products would be free for school children or for those who can't afford them, which I thought was absolutely fantastic. And then I read in your book that China and Japan have menstrual leave for people. It's a legal right, not that they all take it, but it's certainly there, and that's progress.
Completely, and it's such an ignored topic, and yet it's an absolute foundation of 50% of the population and the way that we live and the way that our cycles, our time works. And so I wanted to focus on it because, to be honest, I'd ignored it myself as well. So I'm Gen X, and I was brought up in a generation where you don't really talk about it. All the ads on telly were for sanitary products, as though having a period was somehow not sanitary, or hygiene products, and people jumping off buildings and rollerblading, and I was like, this doesn't. And blue liquid, rather, there's no blood visible in any of this. So the whole thing, there's this sort of silence and shame. And the only thing we're going to talk about is the complete opposite of the experience you're having. In other words, rollerblading and jumping off a building. So for me, the notion of actually listening to your body and understanding what's happening during a monthly cycle felt quite revolutionary. And I think younger women, I'm amazed by them and the nuance in which they understand their bodies, their minds, their lives, their sleep patterns, all of this, because this is something that I've had to learn, and my generation, I think, is learning. But I spoke to a menstrual coach called Kate Shepherd-Cohen to help me understand menstrual cycles. And she, interestingly, divided up the average month into 4 seasons: spring, summer, autumn, winter. And in those seasons, different things are happening hormonally, and different things are happening to your mind and your emotions as well. So winter is when you're actually having your period, and you might feel achy and crampy, and you might also feel introverted and like you don't want to see lots of people. You might not, by the way. These are generalizations, and everyone has an individual experience. But then you move into spring, where your body's preparing to ovulate, and you've got this really high learning capacity, and you might be buzzing, physically energized, really alert, really positive. Now, if I was to look at my team, and I was a manager, and I had half of my team in their spring, would I deploy them to do activities that are very consumer facing, let's say if we're consumer facing business, or something that required really kind of tricky calculations, or something very collaborative? Whereas if they're in their autumn and winter, would I perhaps have them on more admin stuff, back office stuff? And might that help people to thrive and feel like they're on the front foot, rather than kind of lying to themselves in the workplace and trying to fit themselves into a jigsaw pattern that simply doesn't work for them?
There was so much in this. Like I mentioned about sport, and players were managed for their energy as well as everything else. And I know you talk about Chelsea, the coach of the Chelsea women's football team, and I'd love if you share that, because it makes so much sense to me to go, understanding chronotypes is one thing, but understanding energy flows is another. So understanding how somebody, when are they at their most energetic on a different cycle, like on a monthly cycle, becomes really important. And it all goes back to one thing for me, Annie, which is we have moved from an industrial world where you were in a factory and it made sense to have people there for 8 hours and you'd watch them because they were outputting based on the time they were putting in. But in a knowledge economy where everything's moving towards services, product services, and entrepreneurialism, all those kind of things, and selling knowledge services, your work with Starling, for example, all that means that we need to maximize our cognitive abilities. And this is why this makes absolutely sense. Why would I put somebody through the torture of, in their winter, bring them into the office, get them to write out a proposal when they're absolutely in bits, instead of going, okay, well, take your time off, Netflix and chill, the real sense of Netflix and chill. Just chill out, drink whatever, eat chocolate, whatever makes you feel better, because your body is in a different state. So therefore your mind's going to be in a different state. It just absolutely makes no sense that we still put people through this.
I mean, it's just music to my ears hearing you talk like that. But it's true, and it would require just a little bit of a shift in understanding. And you can imagine giving people the freedom to design templates for themselves, which really mean that they work at their very best. And you mentioned Emma Hayes, the coach of Chelsea ladies. And so she studied the impact of menstrual cycles on players' reaction times, on their dexterity, their speed, their coordination, muscle maintenance, all of that kind of stuff. And it's very untouched, really. She says the subject is pushed away like a taboo, but it's really important. And if I had unlimited resources, I would hire someone to manage my players' menstrual cycles. And you can imagine, actually, the most progressive businesses having menstrual coaches. Sometimes, you hear about Silicon Valley perks, which are all about beanbags and unlimited snacks and, laundry and everything done for you. But this is an interesting perspective, which thinking about a menstrual coach to help you be able to design your working month.
It's funny because, she said about unlimited resources. We had there's a brilliant author, Whitney Johnson. She's been on the show several times, and she talks about managing the life cycles of people's careers as well. So if you think of the career as a cyclical journey, so an S curve where it starts off, it's kind of learning, then they get to a period of rapid growth, and then they get to a period of decline or stagnation. And she talks about a HR leader managing that with the workforce. Now, there's a lot of onus on the employee as well to do their work of that. But I just imagine a world where, imagine you had a HR department or an L&D department that managed all these different cycles, where the employees were forthcoming with, like, okay, I'm in winter around these periods. And then, and I'm sure there's some software that can do this quite easily. But imagine the harmony you would have from a constructed, you're an orchestrator of that harmony. How are people's chronotypes? How are people's cycles? Whether are they spring or summer? Where is their energy strongest? Who comes in at 6 a.m.? Who leaves at 3? All these things, and you put them all into a different mixing bowl, and the working world will be a better place, and therefore the world will be a better place, because work and life are synonymous now for so many of us.
Exactly. This is a vision of the future, and it's an inclusive vision. So what you're describing is a workplace that makes space for everybody. You talked about cycles, but neurodiversity, introverts, extroverts, ability, disability, all of that can be taken into consideration. And we know that more inclusive workplaces thrive and are better workplaces, more profitable workplaces even. We haven't even talked about, from the business's perspective, when we don't have a centralized HQ, and we're paying rent on that, you're freeing up capital. And even businesses like HSBC, for example, are reducing their real estate by 40%. They're downsizing. And so, there's a real sense that there's huge benefits to the innovation and the inclusion of the workforce, but also to the business.
Yeah. Annie, I usually finish on a quote, and I've picked one that I absolutely love. I just want to let our audience know there's also a chapter on the future. So flexing into the future, the changing workforce, the need for our constant development and constant learning, et cetera, et cetera. We're not going to go into that, Annie, because we cover a lot of that on the show. And I really wanted to lean in onto these pieces that were so essential for me. And while I'm going to mention your quote, will you have a thought about how you want to leave our audience today? Maybe some parting thought that you want to leave them with. But before I even quote you here, where can people find out more about you, about Starling, etc.?
Oh, thank you. Well, starlingstrategy.co.uk is our business where we look at cultural change and help brands like Nike and Unilever understand how things are changing. And then you can find me on Twitter, Annie Auerbach, and Instagram, Annie Auerbach. I
was telling you the serendipity of this. I wrote about murmurations a few weeks ago, and this is why it's called Starling.
We deliberately called our business Starling. Adam and we're business partners, and we love starling murmurations, which I don't know if you've seen them, but if you have, these beautiful formations of thousands of starlings swooping above you, they're kind of awe-inspiring. But interestingly, what they are is they are reacting to threats and opportunities constantly. They're shape-shifting. And it's a fantastic metaphor for how we need to be in the world at the moment, how brands need to be, but also how business and work needs to be. This is a moment where we really can react to the prevailing winds, and rather than be rigid and set in stone and force people back to a world which excluded so many of us, think about the murmuration and how we can think about a more fluid, visionary future.
We know that the world is changing fast. Rigidity in a world of change means something is going to break, and that thing could be you. And think about it. Many of the jobs we were trained for in school won't exist in a decade. The more robotic our behavior, the more vulnerable we are to the robots that are taking our place. So flex it has to be, for all of us, a movement built on creativity, bravery, anti-convention, and innovation. When we learn to flex, we reinvent the rules for a new future, and it's one in which we all can thrive. I love that, Annie, and that's my parting word for today. How about you? How would you leave it?
Thank you so much. I mean, the same really, in that this is a moment that's ripe for change. I've been tracking it for so long, and there's been so much resistance, and now the world is opening up, and we can design work and life and success patterns which really include us all and allow us all to thrive.
Author of Flex, Annie Auerbach, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.